The night Dean Martin was told to look away, the city was dressed in light. Neon poured itself over wet sidewalks, reflecting the glow of theaters, jazz clubs, and late cafes where laughter spilled as easily as whiskey. To most of the world, this was the golden age of entertainment, a time when voices were smooth, suits were sharp, and smiles never cracked in public. To Dean, it was something else entirely. It was a stage built on unspoken rules. And one of the most powerful rules was simple. Don't see what you're not supposed to see. Dean had just finished a sold-out performance. The applause still rang faintly in his ears as he stepped out of the back entrance of the theater. Coat draped over his arm, tie loosened. The familiar exhaustion of giving pieces of himself to a crowd settling into his shoulders. Fame had a way of isolating you even when people were everywhere. Managers, assistants, producers, strangers with autograph books, they all orbited him constantly. Yet the moments that stayed with him were always the quiet ones. The ones when no cameras were watching. The ones when masks slipped. The alley behind the theater was narrow and dim, lit by a single flickering lamp. Dean was halfway to his car when he heard raised voices. Sharp, angry, the kind that cut through city noise like glass. At first, instinct told him to keep walking. Not because he didn't care, but because caring in his world came with consequences. He had been taught carefully and repeatedly that a star's job was to shine, not to interfere, not to complicate, not to disrupt the machinery that made careers. Dean, you don't want any part of that. The voice came from behind him. It was Frank Delaney, a senior producer who had been in the business longer than Dean had been famous. Frank spoke softly, but there was steel beneath the calm. Dean stopped, slowly turned. Frank's expression wasn't concerned. It was managerial. The look of a man who measured every moment by its risk. There's trouble down the block. Frank continued, glancing toward the alley's far end where shadows moved. Not our trouble. Best thing you can do is get in your car and let it stay that way. Dean followed his gaze. Two figures stood near a service door. One taller, rigid with authority, the other smaller, pressed back against brick. The taller man's hand was on the smaller man's chest. Not violently, not yet, but with enough force to say, I can. Dean felt something shift inside him, a familiar pressure. He had known it since childhood. The weight of watching his father swallow his pride in factory lines. The ache of seeing neighbors treated as invisible. The quiet calculations people made about when to speak and when survival required silence. What's happening? Dean asked. Frank didn't hesitate. Nothing that concerns us. That answer landed harder than any shouted threat. Nothing that concerns us. It was the phrase that kept the world exactly as it was. Dean took a step forward. Frank immediately moved with him, gently blocking his path. Don't, Frank said, low. You step into this, it won't be a scene anymore. It'll be a story, and stories follow you. Sponsors don't like stories. Studios don't like them. And neither do the people who decide which doors stay open. Dean looked at the man who had helped build his career. He saw not cruelty, but fear. The fear of disruption. The fear of losing access. The fear that kept powerful people comfortable and vulnerable people alone. From down the alley, the smaller figure spoke. His voice cracked. I didn't do anything. I just asked if there was a problem. The taller man replied with something Dean couldn't hear clearly. But the tone was enough. Dismissive. Final. The kind of tone that didn't invite. Conversation? Dean's hand tightened around his coat. Frank, he said quietly. You ever notice how every bad story starts with everyone saying it's not their business? Frank exhaled sharply. Dean, you're not built for this kind of trouble. You're built for stages. For music, for escape. Don't trade that for something that won't thank you back. That was the second rule. Courage is rarely rewarded immediately. Dean turned his eyes back toward the two figures. The taller man had shifted his stance. The space between them had closed. Whatever this was, it was not D-escalating. And in that moment, Dean saw two futures. In one, he walked to his car, went home, poured a drink, laughed tomorrow in an interview, sang next week on television, and slowly forgot the sound of that man's voice. In the other, he did something small, something dangerous, something that could fracture the delicate illusion around his life fame had given him. Everything except the right to be ordinary. But it had not taken away his right to be human. Don stepped around Frank. Dean. The word came out sharper now. This is your warning. Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply walked. The taller man turned first, surprised to see a well-dressed stranger approaching, with no fear in his stride. Recognition followed a heartbeat later. Faces had power. Dean Martin's face had a lot of it. Evening, Dean said calmly, stopping a few feet away. Everything all right here? The taller man straightened, his expression rearranging itself. Private business. Dean smiled faintly. Not the stage smile, but the one he used when he wanted to slow a room down. Doesn't look private when it's happening in the open. The smaller man stared at Dean as if unsure whether to trust his own eyes. Hope and caution warred in his expression. This doesn't concern you, the taller man said. Dean nodded. That's what I was told too. He shifted his coat over his arm, exposing the simple white cuff of his shirt. No aggression. No challenge. Just presence? Maybe, Dean continued. You tell me what the problem is. And maybe we solve it without anyone walking away feeling smaller than they arrived. The taller man hesitated. It was only a second. But it was a crack. Power relies on momentum. Attention disrupts it. From behind, Frank called out, Tight, Dean. That's enough. Dean didn't look back. For a long moment, the alley held its breath. The city noise seemed to fade, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the faint echo of laughter from the theater. Two worlds separated by a wall and a choice? The taller man scoffed softly. You don't belong here. Dean met his eyes. Neither does fear. It was a simple sentence, almost unimpressive, but it landed. The man's hand dropped from the other's chest. Not dramatically, not in defeat. Just down, as if the spell of invisibility had been broken. Go. The taller man muttered to the smaller figure. The man didn't move at first. Then he did. One cautious step, then another. Passing Dean, close enough that Dean could see his hands trembling. Thank you, the man whispered. Dean inclined his head. That was all. The taller man lingered a moment longer, eyes hard, calculating. Then he turned and disappeared into the deeper shadow of the alley. Silence rushed back in. Frank reached Dean's side, his face pale. Do you have any idea what you just did? Dean watched the empty space where the two men had stood. I looked. Frank shook his head. You made yourself part of something, and parts get remembered. Dean finally turned. So do people. They stood there, under the flickering lamp, the applause from the theater now fully gone, replaced by something heavier and more honest. Dean felt no triumph, only a strange, steady clarity, the kind that comes not from winning, but from aligning. That night. As he drove home through glowing streets, he knew something had shifted. Not in the city, not in the business in him. He didn't yet know the cost. He didn't yet know the doors that would quietly close, the whispers that would begin. The moments he would later face where courage would no longer be a single choice, but a pattern. But the first step had been taken. And the hardest thing about the first step is this. It teaches the world who you are, and it teaches you that you can no longer pretend you are anything else. The first consequence did not arrive loudly. It did not announce itself with headlines or confrontations. It came the way real consequences often do, quietly, dressed as coincidence. 3 days after the alley, Dean Martin sat in a polished conference room overlooking the city. Sunlight spilling across a long glass table, where contracts normally slid easily toward him. This time, nothing was on the table. Not even water. Across from him sat two studio executives and Frank Delaney, all wearing the same careful expressions people use when they are about to say something unpleasant but professionally reasonable. The kind of faces that claimed concern while preparing distance. Dean, One of the executives began, folding his hands. "We've had a few calls." Dean leaned back slightly. He had learned long ago that leaning forward in these rooms signaled need, and need weakened every position. "Calls about what?" he asked calmly. The man hesitated. "About your visibility," Frank shifted. Dean didn't miss it. "My visibility," Dean repeated. "Yes," the other executive said, forcing a smile. "There are people who prefer their evenings uncomplicated. No scenes, no misunderstandings, and there's a feeling that recently you've complicated things." Dean felt a slow burn under his ribs. Not anger, recognition, so he said, "Someone didn't like that I noticed something." No one corrected him. The first executive cleared his throat. "You're entering a phase of your career where perception matters more than talent. You're no longer just a performer. You're a symbol. And symbols are expected to remain neutral." Dean studied the city through the glass wall. Cars slid along streets like quiet thoughts. People hurried, unaware of how often their lives were negotiated in rooms like this. "Neutral to what?" Dean asked. "To friction," the man replied. "To conflict. To anything that creates discomfort." Dean smiled faintly. Discomfort is how people notice they're alive. That earned him nothing but tighter expressions. Frank finally spoke. "This isn't a punishment, Dean. It's guidance. You don't need to be everywhere. You don't need to respond to everything. Sometimes the strongest position is to stay in your lane." Now Dean looked at him. "And sometimes staying in your lane means driving past someone bleeding on the road." The room fell into a thin silence. The meeting ended without decisions, which was how power often worked. No accusations. No ultimatums. Just a subtle cooling of air, sense that something once automatic had become conditional. Dean left knowing one thing clearly: he had been noticed. Not as an artist, as a variable. That night he didn't go home. He walked. The city after midnight was a different creature. Softer in sound, sharper in truth. Jazz slid out of basement windows. Couples argued in doorways. A man laughed alone on a bench. Dean pulled his coat tighter and moved without destination, letting the rhythm of his shoes on pavement slow his thoughts. He found himself back near the theater district without meaning to, and then, without planning, turned down the same narrow street where the alley waited. The lamps still flickered, but something else was there now, eh? Small cluster of people stood near the service door. Not arguing, not threatening, waiting. Dean slowed. As he approached, one of them recognized him. A young woman with tired eyes and a coat too thin for the cold. Her breath caught. "You're him," she said. Dean stopped a few feet away. "I'm Dean." She shook her head slightly, as if overwhelmed by the fact that a famous name could still belong to a real person. "You're the man from the other night." Two others turned. A middle-aged janitor, a delivery driver still in uniform. And then Dean saw him, the man from the alley, the one whose back had been against the brick. He looked different now, straighter, not braver, but less alone. "We heard who you were," the man said. "Didn't know that then. Only knew you didn't have to stop. And you did." Dean felt something tighten in his throat. "I'm glad you're okay." The man nodded. "I am. But others aren't." That was the sentence that changed the night, the group explained quietly. The area around the theaters had become a hunting ground for a certain kind of authority, unofficial, unaccountable, protected by silence. People who worked late. People who didn't have names that opened doors. People who knew that complaints often created more trouble than they solved. "We've reported things," the janitor said. "They disappear." "We avoid streets," the woman added. "They follow." Dean listened, and with every word, the alley grew larger. It's no longer a single moment, but a pattern. "You stepping in," the first man said. "It broke something. Just a little. And when something breaks, light gets in. People talk." Dean absorbed that. He had spent years learning how to hold attention on a stage. He had never considered what attention could do off it. "What are you asking me?" he said. No one answered immediately. Finally, the woman said, "We're asking you not to go back to not seeing. Dean closed his eyes briefly, because that was the real cost. Not backlash. Not contracts. Not reputation. The cost was continuity. If he stayed present, this wouldn't be a chapter. It would be a direction. I don't know how to fix systems, Dean said slowly. I don't have power like that. The man met his eyes. You don't need power. You need to keep showing up where people expect emptiness. That night, Dean walked them to the corner. He waited while they dispersed. He made sure the man caught his bus, that the woman reached her building, that no one lingered alone. When he finally returned to his car, the city felt altered, as if a hidden layer had been revealed and could no longer be unseen. The second consequence arrived a week later. A booking quietly disappeared. Then a radio appearance. Then a charity gala invitation that had been automatic for years. Frank called him into his office. Irritation barely disguised beneath professional concern. You're being associated with things, Frank said. Stories, neighborhoods, conversations. People don't know what to make of it. Dean leaned against the desk. They don't know what to make of me being human. They don't know what to make of you being unpredictable, Frank corrected. Stars are supposed to be safe. You're becoming complicated, Dean nodded. Good. Frank stared at him. Good is not bankable. Dean smiled gently. Neither is empty. Frank rubbed his face. You're forcing choices on people who don't want to make them. Nice. Dean straightened. Then maybe they've had it too easy. That night, a columnist wrote a thinly veiled piece about performers who mistake attention for authority. It wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was dismissive. Dean read it once. Then he folded the paper and placed it in a drawer, because something else had begun to happen. People started waiting. Outside stages, near service doors, by the edges of events. Not crowds, individuals. A dishwasher whose brother had been taken aside and threatened. A dancer whose friend had vanished from a shift and returned shaken. A taxi driver who knew which street swallowed. Voices, they didn't ask him to rescue them, they asked him to. Listen and listening did something to Dean that. Applause never had it made him. Heavy, but it also made him anchored. Then one evening, after a performance that felt distant even as the audience roared, Dean found a note slipped into his coat pocket. No signature, just an address, and 6 words written in careful ink. If you really want to see, come alone. Dean sat in his dressing room long after everyone left. He turned the paper over. No threats, no explanations, just an invitation. Wrapped in uncertainty, he thought of Frank, of studios, of headlines, of how easy it would be to throw the note away and return to the version of life that Kane had never demanded this kind of weight. Then he thought of the man in the alley, of the woman's eyes, of the word uncomplicated spoken like a virtue. Dean folded the paper and placed it in his wallet, because courage, he was learning, does not usually roar. It whispers, and it always asks for more than you plan to give. The address led Dean away from lights. That alone made it dangerous. It was written simply, without cross streets or instructions, as if whoever had penned it assumed he would understand. And strangely, he did. The location sat beyond the districts where theaters polished the sidewalks and restaurants perfumed the air. This part of the city did not perform. It endured. Dean parked 3 blocks away and walked. The night was colder here. Wind slipped freely between buildings like a thing that had learned no one would stop it. The street lamps were spaced farther apart, casting islands of yellow and long seas of shadow. Windows were fewer, and where they existed, they did not glow. He felt the difference immediately. In the theater district, even silence carried an audience. Here, silence belonged to itself. The building matched the street, narrow, brick, anonymous. No sign, no light in the front window, just a door, old and scarred, with paint worn thin where countless hands had pushed and pulled. Without ceremony, Dean stood across from it for a long moment. This was not an entrance for someone like him. No velvet rope, no doorman, no expectation of safety, only choice. He crossed. The door opened before he knocked. A woman stood there. Mid-40s, maybe older. Her hair was pulled back, her face composed not with makeup, but with endurance. She studied him not as a celebrity, but as a decision. "You came alone," she said. Double quotes, yes. Stepped aside. "Then you can come in." Inside, the building smelled of dust and old paper and something metallic that reminded Dean faintly of rain on stone. The hallway was long, lit by bare bulbs that hummed quietly, as if even electricity spoke softly here. They walked without conversation. At the end of the hall was a room, larger than Dean expected, but stripped. A few folding chairs. A scarred wooden table. A corkboard with papers pinned in no particular order. Names, dates, places. Some crossed out, some circled. None explained. 3 other people were there. 2 men, 1 younger woman. None looked surprised to see him. The woman who had opened the door closed it behind them. "This," she said, gesturing to the room, "is where applause ends." Dean didn't sit. "What is this place?" he asked. The younger woman answered, "Where stories go when they're not believed." One of the men, heavy-set, with eyes that had learned not to waste emotion, stepped forward. "We're not an organization. Not officially. We're what happens when complaints get buried and people refuse to go with them."
House.
Dean looked at the board. "Those are cases," attempts the woman corrected. Most never moved. Some were redirected. A few were erased. Dean felt a tightening in his chest. "And you called me because—" The older woman met his gaze steadily. "Because when you stepped into that alley, you didn't just interrupt a moment. You interrupted a chain. And chains don't like to be seen." She moved to the board and removed a single paper, handed it to him. It was a report, or what remained of one. Names were blacked out, sections torn, dates mismatched, but the location was clear. The same street. 3 months earlier, someone else tried to speak, she said. A stagehand. Quiet man. 30 years in theaters. He didn't have your face. He didn't have your insulation. Dean's eyes traced the incomplete lines. What happened to him? The woman did not answer immediately. The younger woman did. He vanished from his route home. Not forever. Long enough? The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of what had not been written. Dean set the paper down slowly. What are you asking of me? The heavy-set man took a breath. There's a pattern. A private enforcement circle that operates where reputation is leverage and silence is currency. They're protected by people who never appear in the same rooms. People who don't need to raise their voices because their absence already moves things. And, the older woman added, we have proof. But proof without attention dies quietly. Dean exhaled. You want me to be attention? We want you, she said carefully, to make it expensive for them to continue. That was the first time Danger spoke clearly. They showed him what they had. Timelines. Witness statements recorded and then retracted. Employment records altered after incidents. A network of small harms that never made headlines, but changed lives. This doesn't end in a performance, Dean said. No, the woman replied. It ends in consequences. Dean understood the weight of that word. Consequences meant enemies, not critics, not columnists. People whose comfort depended on predictability, on men like Dean staying decorative. And if I don't? He asked. No one threatened him, the younger woman said quietly. Then we keep being a room without doors. Dean looked at each of them. Ordinary faces. Extraordinary persistence. He had filled stadiums. He had quieted rooms with a note, and yet this stripped space, this uncelebrated resistance, frightened him more than any audience ever had. Tell me what you need, he said. The plan was not dramatic. It was precise. They did not want speeches or press conferences. They wanted proximity. In 2 weeks, Dean was scheduled to attend a private industry gathering. Invitation in Eiling. No journalists. No fans. a place where influence relaxed because it believed itself. Unseen, they wanted him to bring something. A recorder. A name. A story that had not yet been denied. They won't suspect you, the heavyset man said, because they don't believe someone with your life would risk contaminating it. Dean almost smiled. What happens when they find out? He asked. The older woman held his eyes. They won't start with you. They'll start around you. That was the real warning. Your work, your friends, your safety, your access. Dean went very still because he finally understood what the alley had truly been, not a test of kindness, a test of continuity, if he agreed. This would not be something he did. It would be someone he became. I'll do it, he said. No one celebrated. The younger woman only nodded once. Then you should know. Others have tried to help us by being careful. Dean looked at her, and careful people are easy to redirect. 2 nights before the gathering, Dean received the call. Frank's voice was strained. We need to talk. They met in a restaurant Dean had practically lived in for years. The owner greeted him warmly, but something had changed. The familiarity carried edges now. Frank didn't order their asking questions, he said. Who is they? Dean replied. Frank hesitated. People who usually don't have to. Dean studied him. About what? About your evenings. Your new friends. Your interests. Dean leaned back. And what did you tell them? Frank rubbed his hands together. That you're restless. That fame makes people look for causes. That it will pass. Dean said nothing. Dean, Frank continued, I've protected you for a long time. You're moving into air I can't control. An air like that. It gets thin. Dean met his eyes. You don't sound worried about me? Frank didn't answer. Dean pressed gently. Are you warning me or negotiating me? Frank's jaw tightened. I'm trying to keep you alive in the only way this world understands. Dean nodded slowly. Then this is where we differ. I'm trying to make sure I am. Frank stood. If you walk into that event carrying whatever you're carrying, understand something. The doors that close won't announce it. You'll just start finding handles where there used to be openings. Dean stood as well. Then I'll learn to push. The night of the gathering arrived without thunder. A restored estate on the outskirts of the city. Long drive. Low music. Expensive quiet. Dean dressed as he always did. Impeccable, familiar, but he felt like a man wearing. His former life as he drove, he touched the small recorder in his inner pocket. Light, almost imaginary, the kind of object that changes. Everything not by force, but by refusing to disappear, he parked. The valet smiled. Inside, voices flowed like warm water. Laughter rose and fell. Glasses chimed. This was where deals softened, where intentions blurred into assurances. Dean moved among them easily because he belonged, and because of that, he was invisible. The estate glowed like a promise. Warm light spilled from tall windows, softening the stone and manicured hedges into something almost kind. Inside, the air carried quiet laughter, polished shoes, and the familiar murmur of people who believed the world bent gently around them. Crystal glasses caught the light. Silk dresses whispered against marble. Music floated not to be heard, but to reassure. Dean Martin stepped into the room and felt it immediately. The difference between being welcomed and being permitted. Hands reached for his. Smiles bloomed. Voices lifted. Dean, you made it. Always a pleasure. Come, you must meet. He moved through them with practiced ease. His expression warm, his tone light, every gesture exactly what the room expected. But beneath the tailored fabric and effortless charm, something new lived inside him, stillness sharpened by intention. The recorder rested against his chest like a second. Heartbeat. He let conversations wash over him at first. Small triumphs. Industry gossip. Gentle complaints about audiences and critics. People spoke as if no one truly listened here, because no one was supposed to. Then he heard a laugh he didn't recognize. Too short. Too satisfied, it came from a smaller group gathered near the fireplace, where the light was softer and the air subtly guarded. 3 men stood there, one older, impeccably composed, one younger, eyes sharp with ambition, and one whose presence felt managerial. Not powerful, useful. Dean slowed. He didn't approach. He drifted. He spoke to a couple near the piano, complimented the decor, accepted a drink he did not sip. Let the gravity of his reputation do what it always did, pull rooms toward him without him having to announce direction. And as he drew closer, the edges of the conversation near the fireplace sharpened. Not about removing problems, the older man was saying calmly. It's about relocating them. Pressure applied in the right places doesn't bruise. It persuades. The younger man smiled. And persuasion keeps the floors clean. Dean's fingers tightened slightly around his glass. The third man, the useful one, chuckled. The mistake people make is thinking silence is passive. Silence is a service. And like all services, it can be arranged. Dean felt something cold move through him. This was it. Not violence, not spectacle, administration of fear. He shifted closer. Gentlemen, he said pleasantly, as if joining any other harmless exchange. You sound like philosophers. They turned, recognition flickering into practiced warmth. Dean Martin, the older man said. Didn't expect to see you here tonight. Dean smiled. Neither did I, but here we are. They made room. He accepted it. They spoke of music, of business, of how industries mature, of how unpredictability, while romantic, rarely sustains success. Then the older man said lightly, We've been discussing a particular district. Around the theaters, difficult area. People misunderstand structure there. Wait. Misunderstand how? The man swirled his drink. They confuse access with entitlement. Dean nodded slowly. And how do you clarify that? The man met his eyes. You don't clarify. You demonstrate.
Ow.
The word landed. Dean inhaled. Then he leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to change the temperature. I was in an alley there 2 weeks ago, he said. A man was being demonstrated to. The first time, something genuine crossed the younger man's face. Interest, the useful one, stilled. The older man smiled faintly. Unfortunate misunderstandings happen everywhere. Dean's tone remained soft. This one didn't misunderstand. He remembered. The air thinned, and Dean continued. So did others. The older man studied him more carefully now. Are you suggesting something, Dean? Dean did not answer immediately. He reached into his inner pocket. They all noticed. He did not. Pull out the recorder. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He opened it, placed it gently. On the marble edge of the fireplace, a name was written. There, one of theirs. Someone tried to speak, Dean said quietly, about how demonstrations are organized, about who benefits, about who makes sure complaints don't travel. Useful man shifted. The younger one's jaw tightened. The older man did not move. Dean looked at each of them. He didn't vanish. Dean went on. He was returned. With enough fear to teach others, the older man's voice remained smooth. You're out of your depth. 8. Dean smiled faintly. No, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. He reached back into his pocket. This time, the recorder emerged. Small, unimpressive, unstoppable. The younger man scoffed softly. You think a toy changes anything? Dean turned the device on. The tiny red light appeared, and suddenly, everything was different. You've already said enough, Dean replied. Silence rushed in. Around them the party continued, but not really. People felt it. Conversations thinned. Glances stretched. The room began to tilt toward the disturbance. It had been trained not to see. The older man's smile disappeared. This ends poorly for you, he said. Dean held the recorder. Between them, so does continuing. The useful man spoke sharply. Turn that off. Dean didn't raise his voice. He raised his eyes. And for the first time that night, he let himself be fully visible. No, he said. The younger man laughed once. Too loud. You walk out of here with that. You don't walk back into what you had. Dean nodded. I know. The older man leaned in slightly. Fame is fragile, Dean. You of all people should understand that. Dean leaned closer. So are people. The older man's eyes hardened. You can still step away. Dean thought of the alley, of the room without applause, of the woman who said stories went there when they weren't believed. He pressed the recorder gently. Against the stone? I already stepped, he said. The silence broke not with shouting, with movement. Guests turned. A few approached. The gravitational shift became visible. What's happening? Is everything all right? Dean lifted the recorder. Probably not, he said clearly. But it's necessary. He spoke then. Not theatrically. Not angrily. Precisely, he told them what he had seen, what he had learned, what had been. Said names, patterns, methods, not accusations, architecture. The room changed. Some faces closed. Some opened. Some revealed nothing. But the silence that followed. His words was not obedience. It was listening. Security moved closer. Frank appeared at the edge of the room. Face pale. Dean saw him. Held his gaze. Frank shook his head almost imperceptibly. Dean smiled gently. The older man spoke again. Door now. You have no idea what you've just aligned yourself against. Dean turned to him one last time. Yes, he said. I do. He walked. Not hurried, not triumphant. Each step carried weight as he passed people. Some looked away. Some stared. One woman reached out, briefly touching his arm. He didn't know her, but her eyes said everything. Outside, the night air struck his lungs like truth. The valet hesitated when he saw Dean's face. Dean took his keys. Himself, he sat in the car for a long moment before starting it. His hands were steady, but something inside him was breaking open. Not fear, finality. In the weeks that followed, the consequences arrived, not as explosions, as absences. Calls not returned, invitations lost, projects postponed, smiles that no longer reached eyes. And then, other calls from people he had never met, journalists, advocates, quiet officials. The woman from the room. Without applause, they had his recording. And more, the story did not resolve. Cleanly, real ones never do, but doors that had been sealed began to crack. Files resurfaced. People were asked questions they could not elegantly avoid. And something unfamiliar entered those districts. Observation months later. Dean stood on a smaller stage. No broadcast, no grand introductions, eh? Community fundraiser in a neighborhood few limousines visited. The applause was scattered, uneven. Real, afterward. A young man approached him, nervous, grateful. Probably lost a lot, he said. Dean considered. That then he smiled. I stopped pretending. Loss only happens when you drop. Something, he replied. The young man nodded. Not fully understanding, Dean placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Sometimes, he added, you lose the blindfold. That night, walking to his car, Dean passed a narrow alley. A different one. Still dim. Still quiet, but a light burned at the far end. And he walked toward it. Not because he expected applause, but because he no longer needed permission to see.